The waiting room at Vithrani Consolidated Academy smelled like ozone and something faintly biological, the way a lab smells when the ventilation is working hard and the work inside it is harder. There were 14 of us in the intake bay, 13 aliens, 1 human. The seats were shaped for bodies that hinged in places mine didn't, so I sat the way I always sit in alien furniture, straight-backed, weight distributed evenly, feet flat on the floor. Not because I was trying to look composed. Because it was the most comfortable position available. The Academy's intake bay was a long room with polished floors and walls that curved slightly inward at the upper thirds, which I'd read somewhere was a Vithrani architectural convention, something to do with acoustics and the way Vithrani compound eyes processed peripheral space. The effect, from where I was sitting, was that the room felt very slightly like being inside an egg. A clean, well-lit, impeccably maintained egg occupied by 14 nervous candidates, and a reception desk staffed by a Vithrani administrative specialist, who moved with the focused efficiency of someone who had processed hundreds of intake cohorts, and was not particularly impressed by any of them. The others noticed me the way they always do, not all at once. In small increments, a glance held a half-second too long, a head tilted at an angle that read as assessment on every species I'd encountered. A young Vithrani cadet 2 seats down studied the backs of my hands for a full minute before deciding I wasn't aware of it. I was aware of it. I let it go. Hands were a reasonable thing to be curious about. I'd been curious about a lot of alien anatomy in my time, and I'd had the grace not to stare. My name is Ezra Callum. I was 29 years old when I walked into the Vithrani Consolidated Academy's intake bay, and I had been working in wilderness survival instruction on the colony world Vostereth for 6 years before that. Vostereth sits at a threat level 7 rating on the Galactic Standard Hazard Index. Most species don't maintain permanent settlements there. The ones that do tend to develop institutional habits that look, from the outside, like recklessness, and look, from the inside, like ordinary Tuesday. I hadn't come to the academy because I lacked credentials. I'd come because the credentials I had were not recognized within the Galactic Standard curriculum. That was the official language. The unofficial language, which I'd pieced together from 3 separate intake forms and 1 very careful conversation with a Vithrani registrar, was that human qualifications from a non-standard posting couldn't be assessed without a baseline evaluation. And the baseline evaluation at Vithrani Consolidated Academy was the sequence. Everyone called it the sequence. The official name was the Vithrani Graduated Psychophysiological Assessment Battery, and the documentation I'd been given described it in language that was precise and dense and almost entirely technical. I'd read it twice on the shuttle over, and then I'd read the unofficial guide that a third-year human student named Priya Mehta had posted on the Academy's internal network before she'd been asked, very politely, to take it down. Her post had been up for 11 hours. Enough people had copied it that copies were still circulating. Priya had gotten to stage 4. Stage 4 was, according to the official documentation, the cognitive fragmentation drill, a simultaneous multi-domain stimulus array designed to test a candidate's ability to maintain structured decision-making under conditions of maximal information overload. According to Priya's post, it felt like having 6 separate arguments with 6 separate people in 6 separate languages, while someone was reading your mail aloud, and a light was flickering at exactly the wrong frequency. She described it without melodrama, which made it more useful. I'd found 3 other human candidates who'd attempted the sequence. 1 had reached stage 4. 2 had reached stage 3, which was the pain tolerance mapping protocol. All 3 had filed incomplete assessments. None of them had been asked to leave. The academy didn't work that way. You stopped when you stopped. The proctor logged your final stage and extrapolated a placement score from there, and you were placed accordingly, and that was the end of it. The question nobody had answered to my satisfaction was what happened if you didn't stop. The full sequence ran 8 stages. Each one was longer and more intensive than the last. Stages 1 through 3 were physical in nature. They measured baseline physiological response, cardiovascular endurance under load, pain threshold, response latency under controlled tissue stimulus. Stages 4 and 5 were cognitive, the fragmentation drill and the fear stimulus injection protocol. Stages 6, 7, and 8 had names in the documentation, but the names were Vithrani technical terminology and the translations were vague. Stage 6 was listed as the fatigue cascade. Stage 7 was listed as the integration dissolution protocol. Stage 8 was listed simply as the ceiling test. The documentation noted that no candidate in the Academy's recorded history had completed Stage 8 and submitted a final answer packet within the standard A-Tower assessment window. Candidates who reached Stage 8 and ran out of time were given full credit for the attempt. In the history of the Academy, 11 candidates had reached Stage 8. None had finished it. I'd noted all of this and set it aside. I wasn't there to break records. I was there to get my credentials recognized so I could teach survival methodology at the advanced level without a provisional classification hanging over every course I ran. Records were beside the point. Getting through the sequence, whatever that meant, however far I got, was the point. The intake proctor was a Vithrani administrative specialist named Advisor Holith. She had the characteristic Vithrani build, tall, bilaterally symmetrical in the general sense, but with joints that moved along planes I'd had to train myself not to track, because watching a Vithrani walk was the kind of thing that took up attentional bandwidth you needed for other purposes. Her skin was the pale gray-silver common to her caste, and her eyes were the compound-faceted variety that gave Vithrani excellent peripheral vision and very little depth perception at close range. When she looked at me directly, she was doing it with a slightly offset focal point, which I'd learned early was not rudeness but anatomy. She reviewed the intake forms with a stylus that moved faster than I could follow and asked me a series of questions about my Vostereth posting in a tone that was professionally neutral. Professional neutrality on a Vithrani is slightly different from professional neutrality on a human. There's a quality to their stillness that reads, if you don't know them well, like a held breath. I'd worked with enough of them that I recognized it as focus rather than tension. You are listed as an adult transfer from a non-standard posting, she said. Your credentials were reviewed by the Standard Intake Committee and flagged for a mandatory baseline assessment. This is standard procedure for candidates whose prior training occurred outside the galactic curriculum. I understand. The baseline assessment is the sequence. You have been provided documentation. I have. She looked at me with the offset focal point that meant she was studying me without appearing to. The average completion time for the sequence, across all species and all cohorts, is 4 hours and 12 minutes. That represents the average time to candidate discontinuation, the point at which a candidate elects to stop, not completion of all stages. No candidate has completed all stages within the standard window. I read that in the documentation. She set the stylus down. That was a small tell. Vithrani administrators didn't set their styluses down unless they were about to say something they decided wasn't in the form. Mr. Callum, the sequence is calibrated for species with a recognized ceiling on neural stress tolerance. The escalation protocol is designed to find that ceiling efficiently and without causing permanent harm. In your case, the committee was unable to locate comparative data for human neural stress tolerance under the sequence's specific stimulus profile. This means the sequence will be running an uncalibrated escalation. I waited. An uncalibrated escalation means the proctor AI will continue escalating stimuli until it receives a discontinuation signal. The system is designed to stop well before permanent harm in all known species. In your case, the stop thresholds are derived from the closest analogous species data available, which is a margin estimate and not a certainty. She paused. I am required to tell you this before you sign the consent form. What's the closest analogous species? The Durath. They are a carbon-based bilaterally symmetrical species with a roughly comparable neural density index. They have the highest recorded stress tolerance of any species that regularly undergoes the sequence. What stage do Durath candidates typically reach? Stage 5, occasionally stage 6. I thought about that. Okay. You understand the information I have given you? Yes. You consent to the uncalibrated escalation? Yes. She handed me the form, I signed it, she retrieved her stylus. The assessment room is this way. The assessment room was smaller than I'd expected. Rooms designed for significant events tend to announce themselves architecturally: high ceilings, wide entries, the visual grammar of importance. This room was the size of a generous office. It had a chair in the center that was more sophisticated than a chair had any right to be. It articulated. It had attachment points for the monitoring array, and its surface was a material that adjusted to body temperature and pressure distribution in ways I could feel happening under me as I sat down. There was a table to my left with a water dispenser and a container of what the documentation had described as a neutral caloric supplement, standard issue, formulated for human metabolism in accordance with the galactic minimum standard for assessment nutrition. A proctor node was mounted at the front of the room, a smooth ovoid about the size of a large melon, matte black, with an indicator light that was currently amber. Advisor Holleth attached the monitoring array herself, sensor pads at the temples, the wrists, the sternum, the base of the neck. She moved with the competence of someone who had done this many times and knew what she was doing, and she didn't ask me to do anything I hadn't already done by the time she needed it done. The sequence begins when the indicator light turns green, she said. You may discontinue at any time by saying discontinue or by pressing the manual stop plate on the armrest. There is no penalty for discontinuation. Your assessment will be scored based on your final completed stage. What happens if I finish stage 8? The offset focal point again, a beat of Vithrani stillness. The proctor will log a completion event and generate a full assessment score. The committee will review. The review process for a full completion event would be significant, as it has not occurred before. Okay. Mr. Callum, she paused at the door. The Academy's intake committee reviewed your Vostereth posting records. I am not on the committee and the records are not part of my purview, but I was made aware of the threat level classification. She looked at me with the offset focus for a moment. Good luck. She left, the door sealed. The indicator light turned green. Stage 1 was cardiovascular load assessment. In the documentation, this had sounded clinical and bounded, and in practice it was clinical and bounded. The chair reclined to horizontal, the monitoring array tracked my vitals, and the room introduced a stimulus load that elevated my heart rate through a combination of controlled hypoxia and low-frequency audio pressure. The experience was not pleasant. It was also not new. Vostereth had elevations where the oxygen content was low enough that the body learned, over time, to run on less of it and work harder for what it had. My cardiovascular baselines had been tested in conditions that made this room look like a polite suggestion. I breathed the way I'd been taught to breathe, slow, deliberate, nasal when possible. The kind of breathing that keeps a heart rate from spiking and keeps a mind from the feedback loop, where the awareness of discomfort amplifies the discomfort. At some point during stage 1, I became aware that the proctor AI was adjusting. I couldn't see it doing this. There was no display, no readout, but I could feel the parameters shift. The hypoxia deepened. The audio pressure increased. The chair reconfigured slightly, which I hadn't expected, introducing a mild postural stress that compounded the cardiovascular demand. The adjustments were incremental and they were looking for something. I recognized the shape of the search. The proctor was running a gradient ascent toward my ceiling, and every time I failed to respond the way it expected, it stepped the gradient steeper. It took me a while to recognize that this was the uncalibrated escalation Advisor Holleth had described. The sequence was designed to find a ceiling. It was adjusting because it wasn't finding mine where it expected to find it. Stage 1 ended. The indicator light pulsed once. Stage 2 was a physical load assessment, sustained exertion against graduated resistance. This was the most straightforwardly physical stage, and it had a clarity to it that I appreciated. The chair reconfigured into something closer to a frame, and the monitoring array introduced a resistance element that worked against sustained muscular effort in a series of increasingly demanding intervals. The documentation had described this stage as comparable, in its lower registers, to sustained load-bearing work at approximately 1.5 times standard gravity. In its upper registers, it was calibrated to the load-bearing capacity of the strongest species that regularly underwent the sequence. I'd spent 4 years of my Vastereth posting doing trail work in terrain that required full pack carry at 1,500 meters of elevation, in weather that shifted faster than a forecast could track, on trails that were sometimes trails and sometimes suggestions. The resistance load in Stage 2's lower registers felt familiar. The upper registers were harder. I worked through them methodically, which is the only way to work through anything that is genuinely difficult, 1 unit at a time, without counting the units remaining. At some point in Stage 2's upper registers, I became aware that the monitoring array was tracking my metabolic processing at a level of detail that went beyond standard physiological documentation. The sensor pads were measuring things I hadn't felt them measure before, not just heart rate and blood pressure and oxygen saturation, but something in the neural load spectrum that I recognized from the spec sheets for the monitoring array model. They were measuring neural coherence. Specifically, the degree to which the brain's electrical activity remained organized and patterned under load, rather than fragmenting into the high-entropy noise pattern that characterized extreme stress response in most species. My neural coherence was, apparently, not doing what the proctor expected. Stage 2 ended. The indicator light pulsed twice. Stage 3 was the pain tolerance mapping protocol, and this was where the 2 previous human candidates who'd made it this far had stopped. Pain is an information system. That's the frame I'd been given by the survival instructors who trained me, and it had taken me years of working with it before I understood what they meant. Not that it doesn't hurt, it hurts. That's the point. The information content is the hurt, but that the hurt carries a message, and the message is more useful than the hurt is dangerous. An injury that signals damage is useful. Pain that signals escalating stimulus without damage is a different category of information, and the brain can learn to sort the categories. The pain tolerance mapping protocol worked through a series of controlled stimuli. Not injurious, the documentation was explicit about this, calibrated carefully below the tissue damage threshold, that activated pain response pathways in escalating intensity and duration. The experience was, in its lower registers, like the general soreness of a long day's work. In its middle registers it was more specific, more insistent, the way a deep bruise feels when you press it. In its upper registers it was something I didn't have a clean comparison for, a whole-body signal at high volume that demanded a response. I knew what response it was looking for. The pain response system is designed to trigger behavioral change. Stop what you're doing, attend to the signal, remove yourself from the stimulus. The sequence was measuring how long it took for that design to activate and at what intensity. I didn't remove myself from the stimulus. I stayed with the signal, and I breathed and I noticed it. That's the technical description of what I'd been taught to do. Notice the pain rather than resist it or flee it. Notice it the way you notice weather. It's real, it's significant, it's not something you're fighting, it's something you're in. The distinction sounds theoretical until you've actually had to use it, and then it becomes as practical as any physical skill. The proctor escalated and recalibrated and escalated again. At some point I realized, with a distant and somewhat academic interest, that I had been in stage 3 longer than the documentation suggested was typical. The documentation had given a range of 12 to 40 minutes for stage 3 across all candidate species. I didn't have a clock, the room had no displays, but the subjective duration felt longer than 40 minutes. The proctor was not finding its ceiling. Stage 3 ended. The indicator light pulsed 3 times. I drank water. I ate some of the caloric supplement, which tasted like nothing in particular and had the texture of slightly stale bread. Both of these were good practice. The body makes decisions about energy management during sustained stress, and the decisions it makes are better with fuel in it. Stage 4 was the cognitive fragmentation drill, and this was the stage that Priya Mehta had described, and that all 3 of the human comparison cases had reached, and none had passed. The best description I can give of stage 4 is that the room stopped being a room in the cognitive sense. The physical architecture remained walls, ceiling, chair, table, but the information load it was carrying became simultaneous and contradictory in ways that made processing it feel like standing in a river, not a calm one. The monitoring array introduced a direct low-level neural stimulus overlay, legal and non-injurious under galactic assessment standards, that produced the subjective experience of multiple simultaneous cognitive demands competing for processing priority. Alongside this, the room's audiovisual systems ran a structured stimulus array, multiple simultaneous information streams, some of them requiring active response, and some of them designed as distractors. Priya had been right that it was like having 6 arguments simultaneously. What she'd understated, or what I found different from her description, was the quality of the thing the proctor was doing underneath the obvious overload. The obvious overload was loud and attention-grabbing and dense. Under it, quiet and persistent, the proctor was running a low-intensity repetitive stimulus that worked on a different channel entirely, not the channel that processes information at the volume of 6 arguments, but the channel that handles background pattern recognition. It was trying to establish a cognitive fatigue baseline through the back door, while I was busy with the front door. I'd seen this approach before. Not in this form. I'd never been in an assessment room with a proctor AI, but in the wilderness, where the most dangerous conditions are not the loud ones. The loud ones announce themselves. The dangerous ones are the accumulating background stressors that you don't notice until they've already taken something from you. Hypothermia doesn't feel like anything until it's taken enough that you don't feel much at all. Sleep deprivation at its early stages feels like ordinary tiredness. The river you're trying to cross has been rising slowly for an hour before you step into it. I worked the front door, kept up with the active response demands, sorted the distractor streams into background, maintained the primary task thread. And I stayed aware of the back door, which means I didn't let myself sink into the background pattern that the low-intensity stimulus was trying to establish. The proctor recalibrated. The front door got louder. The back door got more insistent. I worked the front door and stayed aware of the back door and breathed. Stage 4 ended. The indicator light pulsed 4 times. I became aware at this point that the amber-edged light under the proctor node was doing something it hadn't been doing in the earlier stages. It was flickering slightly, not in the distraction stimulus way, which was a distinct rhythmic pattern, but in the irregular way that indicated the proctor node was running a non-standard process. I couldn't be certain. I didn't have the technical background to read proctor hardware diagnostics from a flicker pattern, but my working hypothesis was that the proctor AI was running a re-evaluation protocol. It had been expecting to be done by now. Stage 5 was the fear stimulus injection protocol. Fear is also an information system. This is harder to maintain as a frame than it is for pain, because fear triggers a cascade rather than a signal. Pain is a message, fear is a mobilization. The cascade floods the system with prioritization signals. Everything narrows, options contract. The world simplifies to the fear object and the options for responding to it. This is functional design. In an environment where a real threat exists, this narrowing is survival useful. In an assessment room where the threat is artificially constructed, the narrowing is the enemy. The fear stimulus injection protocol worked through a combination of the neural stimulus overlay, which was now running at a higher amplitude than it had in stage 4, and a direct sensory environment that the room constructed around me. I won't describe what it showed me. The specifics aren't relevant, and they were calibrated to my personal fear stimulus profile, which the proctor had been building since stage 1. They were realistic. They were alarming. They were not real. I knew they were not real. Knowing this doesn't stop the cascade. The cascade is not a cognitive process. It's a systems-level response that precedes cognition. What cognition can do, if it's fast enough, is catch the cascade at the top and hold it there. Not stop it. The cascade will run. That's design. But hold the behavioral outputs. Observe the narrowing and choose, deliberately, not to narrow your behavioral options with it. I had held the cascade in real situations. I had held it in a whiteout at 3,000 meters on Vostereth with a cadet who'd broken his leg, and a weather window that was closing and 2 hours of daylight left. I had held it when a Vostereth predator, a class 4, large enough to take an adult human in a single close contact encounter, had found our camp at night and spent 40 minutes working its way around the perimeter, methodical and patient, and in no particular hurry. I had held it in a cave flood where the water came up faster than the models said it should, and the exit route we'd planned was already gone. None of those situations had had an off switch. This one did. It was on the armrest and I didn't press it. The difference between the real situations and this one was that in the real ones I had the option of action, of doing something that would change the situation. Moving the cadet, building a shelter, repositioning against the predator, finding the alternative route in the rising dark. Action was a destination for the cascade's energy. You could metabolize the fear by directing it into movement, into problem solving, into the next step that might make things better. Here in the chair in the room, there was no next step that would change the situation. The situation was the protocol. It would end when it ended. The only option was to be in it without acting on its behavioral demands, to feel the mobilization without mobilizing, to carry the cascade without letting it direct traffic. This is, I had come to understand, the most difficult version of the thing. Sitting still in fear is harder than moving through it. The body does not like to be mobilized and held simultaneously. It's an internal contradiction that demands resolution, and the resolution it wants is the off switch on the armrest. The cascade ran toward that resolution like water running downhill. I held it above the armrest. I breathed through the top of it, the way you breathe through the top of a wave, not fighting it, not going under, letting it break over you and being there when it receded. The wave broke. I was still there. The proctor escalated once more in the last portion of stage 5. A final gradient step that was harder than anything that had preceded it in the stage. I felt it arrive and held the behavioral outputs and breathed and waited for it to pass, which it did, because everything passes. The fear stimulus injection protocol ended. The indicator light pulsed 5 times. I drank more water. I was aware that my hands were steady, which I noted as useful data. My heart rate had spiked in stage 5 and was coming back down. The monitoring array was tracking the recovery curve. I could feel it in the way the sensor pad's readings felt slightly warmer during the peak load and cooled as the recovery progressed. A minor sensation, but attention to minor sensations was what the back half of Vostereth training built. The proctor node's amberage flicker had become more pronounced. Whatever non-standard process it was running harder now. Stage 6 was the fatigue cascade. The documentation had described this stage as a graduated sleep deprivation and metabolic depletion simulation, but that description had the quality of a sanitized summary. What the stage actually involved was a systematic attack on the body's recovery mechanisms. The neural stimulus overlay introduced a continuous low-level arousal signal that prevented the micro-recovery periods that the nervous system normally inserts during sustained activity. The brief gaps where attention resets, where the working memory stack clears, where fatigue compounds logarithmically rather than exponentially. The room's environmental controls adjusted temperature and pressure to increase metabolic load. The chair's surface reconfigured to prevent postural comfort. The goal of the fatigue cascade was simple: exhaust the candidate's available resources at a rate faster than the candidate could replenish them, until the candidate's effective cognitive performance dropped below the assessment threshold. I had spent 6 days on Vastarath once without more than 2 hours of sleep. Not by choice. A combination of circumstances, a storm that grounded extraction, a cadet with complications from a plant contact injury that needed monitoring, terrain that required active navigation to hold position against, had put me in a situation where the math on sleep simply didn't add up. I had been functional on day 6, not sharp, not at my best, but functional, making decisions, moving the right direction, keeping the injured cadet alive. On the 7th day, the extraction came through, and I slept for 14 hours. The fatigue cascade was trying to do, in an assessment room, what 6 days of genuine adversity had done on Vastarath. It was doing it faster and more precisely, because it had 6 stages of physiological data to work with and a calibrated delivery system. It was not messing around. I matched its pace the way you match a river's pace when you're wading upstream, not fighting it, matching it. I took the water and caloric supplement when I felt the need rather than waiting for the need to become urgent. I adjusted my posture when the chair reconfigured, finding stability in each new configuration rather than fighting the instability. I kept the neural stimulus overlay out of the center of my attention. I could feel it running, persistent and low, trying to crowd out the recovery windows, and I managed what recovery I could in the margins it left. The fatigue cascade ran long. I had no clock, but it ran long. The earlier stages had had a quality of escalation and plateau that made the stage transitions feel relatively crisp. Stage 6 didn't plateau. It kept finding new angles. Thermal, postural, metabolic, cognitive load supplementals introduced late in the stage that layered new demands on top of the existing ones. The proctor was being thorough. There was a quality to this kind of sustained assault that I found useful to understand in terms of the body's decision-making hierarchy. The body under sustained stress is a negotiator. It is constantly prioritizing between competing demands and allocating resources accordingly. The highest priority is always the brain, because the brain is the decision engine, and the decision engine must run. Second priority is the core musculature, which keeps the organism upright and moving. Everything beyond that is allocated based on available surplus. Stage 6 was designed to eliminate the surplus. Not all at once, incrementally, methodically, stage by stage, so that the body's negotiation had progressively fewer resources to work with. By the late portion of the stage, the available surplus was genuinely thin. I could feel the triage happening, attention narrowing, minor sensory inputs going to background, the body quietly deprioritizing everything that wasn't immediately essential. This is where less experienced candidates tended to make errors. The narrowing feels like losing control, the cognitive field is contracting, the options are reducing, the complexity of the world is simplifying in a way that feels like damage. And it is, in a limited sense, damage. Fatigue does reduce cognitive capacity and the reduction is real. But the error is to treat the reduction as collapse. It isn't collapse. It's the organism's edited version of itself, smaller, simpler, but still organized, still running. The edited version, if you know how to work inside it, can carry you further than the unedited version under stress, because it isn't spending energy on things that don't matter. I knew how to work inside it. I'd had 6 years of practice. At some point in the late portion of stage 6, I experienced the thing I associate with the far end of genuine fatigue, a clarification. Not a second wind, which is a cardiovascular phenomenon with a specific mechanism. A clarification. The noise drops out. The things that aren't essential stop clamoring for attention because the system has stopped having the energy to process non-essentials. What remains is very clear and very simple. What do I need to do right now, and what is the next thing after that? On Vastarath, the clarification had felt like a gift. It had arrived at the end of day 4 and carried me through days 5 and 6. Here, in the assessment room, it felt like recognition. I was at a place I'd been before, and the familiar territory was an advantage. Stage 6 ended. The indicator light pulsed 6 times. I ate everything that remained in the caloric supplement container. I drank all the remaining water. The dispenser refilled automatically, which I appreciated. I drank again. The proctor node's flicker had stabilized into a new pattern, slower, more regular, that I hadn't seen before. I didn't know what it meant. I filed it as data and moved on. Stage 7, the Integration Dissolution Protocol. The documentation's translation of this stage name had always struck me as vague in a way that might be intentional or might be a translation limitation. Integration dissolution. The combination of those two concepts suggested something about structure, about the formation and destruction of structured patterns. In a neural context, integration was the binding of disparate processing streams into coherent experience, and dissolution was the failure of that binding. Integration dissolution, as a protocol, might be measuring the conditions under which coherent experience fell apart. That was, as it turned out, accurate. Stage 7 worked at the level of perception itself. The neural stimulus overlay, which had been operating throughout the earlier stages as a background pressure, now shifted into the foreground, not louder, but more precisely targeted. What it was targeting, I understood within the first few minutes, was the binding layer. The part of neural processing that holds the sensory streams together into a unified experience of being in a specific place, at a specific time, with a specific identity. The room became intermittently uncertain. Not in a hallucinatory sense. I was never convinced I was somewhere else. More in the way that a familiar word becomes temporarily opaque when you look at it too long. The certainty of it loosened, and under the loosening was something that didn't have a floor. I had experienced a version of this before. Not through any protocol, through oxygen deprivation at altitude on Vastarath, at a point where I'd pushed the elevation margin too far on a search sweep, and the thin air had done something to the binding layer before I recognized what was happening. The experience of finding myself briefly uncertain of where I was, what year it was, what the sequence of events had been that had put me on a ridge at 3,000 meters in a dying afternoon. I had managed it then by finding an anchor, something concrete and verifiable and immediate. The weight of the pack, the temperature of the air, the sound of my own breathing, something that put me in the body and in the present because the body is always in the present. I used anchors, the pressure of the chair under me, the faint residual warmth of the caloric supplement in my throat, the weight of the monitoring array pads at my temples, the sound of air moving through the ventilation system at a rate, and texture I could characterize in enough detail to occupy the part of my attention that the dissolution was trying to claim. The anchor technique is not complicated in description. You find something concrete and present and verifiable through one of the reliable senses, pressure, temperature, sound, the texture of a surface, and you direct enough attention toward it that it serves as a reference point, a fixed mark. The dissolution works by loosening the self's grip on the present moment and on its own history, and the anchor is a reminder that the present moment is real and the self is in it. A warm throat. a weight at the temples, air at a specific temperature moving at a specific rate. The body is always in the present tense, even when the mind is not. You use the body to pull the mind back. The proctor pushed harder. The loosening deepened. There were moments when I was less certain of the sequence than I wanted to be. What stage was this? How long had I been here? What had come before? And I used the anchors to return, each time, to the present tense facts of the body in the room. Stage 7 ran. I ran it. Stage 7 ended. The indicator light pulsed 7 times. I sat in the clarified quiet for a moment. There was a quality to the room now that it hadn't had at the beginning, a stillness, as if the room itself was waiting. The proctor node's indicator was amber again, steady, and the flicker that had been running since stage 4 was absent. I didn't know if that was significant. I drank water. I sat. I breathed. I felt the genuine tiredness in my body, not the artificially escalated fatigue of stage 6, but the underneath tiredness that had been there for the whole assessment and was now simply present and acknowledged. It was substantial. It was manageable. Stage 8, the ceiling test. The documentation had given no further description than the name. I had found nothing else in any available source. Priya's post hadn't reached stage 8. The 11 candidates who had reached it had not, as far as I could determine, published accounts of what they'd found there. The translation of the Vithrani term that glossed to ceiling test had the quality of a literal rendering. The stage was, apparently simply, "This is the ceiling. Whatever you have left, bring it here, and we will find out if it is enough." The room changed. Not dramatically, there was no shift in the environmental systems, no new orientation of the chair, no obvious escalation of the neural stimulus overlay. What changed was the character of the demand. The previous 7 stages had each been isolable, discrete protocols with identifiable targets, escalating intensity within a defined category. Stage 8 was not discrete. It was simultaneous. Everything the previous stages had measured came online together. Cardiovascular load, physical resistance, pain signal, cognitive fragmentation, fear stimulus, fatigue cascade, integration dissolution. Not at stage 7 intensities. At something that I didn't have a reference point for, because the reference point was whatever was on the other side of the ceiling. I had never thought of my ceiling as a ceiling. That language implies a surface you can hit, a structure with a defined top. I'd thought of it as a horizon. The horizon moves as you approach it. It is not a limit. It is the current edge of your visibility, and what lies beyond it is not an absence but a continuation. The sequence was trying to find my ceiling. It had designed 8 stages to do this systematically and thoroughly, and with all the sophistication of whatever species had built it. It was running all of it simultaneously now, and it was looking. I was still in the room, I was still in the chair, I was still breathing. The simultaneity was the genuine challenge. Each individual component of stage 8 was something I'd already encountered, harder here than in its own stage, but recognizable. The integration of them was the unknown. The way they compounded and interacted and fed back into each other. The pain amplifying the fear. The fatigue undermining the anchors I needed for the dissolution protocol. The cognitive fragmentation making the fear cascade harder to hold at the behavioral level. It was a system, and it was running. I didn't fight the system. Fighting it would have cost more than I had. I worked inside it, the way you work inside bad weather. Not against the wind, but across it, finding the angles where the load was momentarily lighter, spending what you have on the things that matter and not on the things that don't. What mattered under all of it was coherence. That was what the sequence was trying to dissolve. Stage 8's ultimate target, I understood now, was not pain or fear or fatigue in isolation, but the coherent self that experiences and processes all of them. If the self could be fragmented, if the integration could be broken comprehensively enough that the candidate could no longer function as a unified agent, that was the ceiling. The point past which the candidate could not continue. I was still a unified agent, tired, thoroughly stressed, running on clarified simplicity and the residue of 6 years of Vastarath training, but unified, present, still here. The proctor escalated again. I'd expected this. The gradient ascent would continue as long as I didn't provide the discontinuation signal. It escalated and I stayed with it, and it escalated more. I was aware, at some level of the cognitive process that remained intact for meta-observation, that I was in genuinely unknown territory. No human had reached this stage. I had no comparison case, no guidepost, no Priya Meta who'd been here and posted 11 hours worth of notes before being asked to take them down. There was only what I was experiencing and what I had learned, and the fact of being still in the room. I found in the deep interior of Stage 8 something I hadn't anticipated, a stillness. Not the absence of the load was fully present, all of it, simultaneous and massive. But underneath the load, the way the riverbed is underneath the river, there was something that wasn't moving. Something that had been there through all 8 stages and all the escalations and all the calibrations and recalibrations, and that the sequence had not managed to touch. I didn't have a clean name for it. On Vastarath, the older instructors had called it the floor, not a ceiling that you hit but a floor that you find, when everything else has been stripped away, still under your feet. You didn't find the floor by looking for it. You found it by going far enough into the difficulty that everything unnecessary had been taken, and discovering what remained. What remained was the work. What remained was the next breath and the next decision and the next step, whatever it was. What remained was a human being in a room, doing a thing. The sequence ran, I ran it. And then something happened that I would struggle afterward to describe accurately. Not a dramatic break. Not a moment of triumph or relief. More like a plateau, the escalation reached a level and held there, and I held with it, and the escalation did not increase further. The proctor was at the top of its gradient. It had escalated as far as its protocol allowed, or as far as its stimulus systems could deliver, or as far as its assessment framework defined as the maximum. It was at the ceiling. I was on the other side of it, sitting in the chair, still breathing. The room changed again. The environmental loads eased. The neural stimulus overlay reduced not to 0, but to a background level that felt almost comfortable after what had preceded it. The physical resistance elements withdrew. The fear stimulus protocol stepped down through its stages in the reverse order it had arrived. One by one, the components of Stage 8's simultaneous load disaggregated, and the room became, incrementally, the assessment room it had started as. The proctor node's indicator light, which had gone a color I hadn't seen it go before during Stage 8, not amber, not green, something in the cool white register, returned to amber. Steady, no flicker. A new element appeared on the table to my left, which I hadn't noticed until it was there. A datapad screen active, with a prompt requesting final answer submission. The documentation had mentioned this, in the section I'd read twice on the shuttle. The final answer packet was a structured document, 17 questions covering cognitive assessment, procedural knowledge in the candidate's primary discipline, and adaptive reasoning under constrained conditions. It was timed from the point of appearance, but the documentation had also noted that candidates who reached the final answer submission were given credit for reaching it regardless of whether they completed the packet within the remaining window. I picked up the datapad. The 17 questions were not trivial. 3 of them required extended written responses. 4 required multi-step procedural solutions. 2 required extrapolation from partial information. The remaining 8 were structured decision matrix problems that had a surface simplicity and an underlying complexity. The kind of problems that reward you for looking at them from slightly further back than the obvious angle. I worked through them methodically, one at a time without counting the ones remaining. The writing was slower than it would have been 8 hours ago. My fine motor coordination had taken some of the cost, the same way it does at the end of a long day in the field, but the thinking was clear. The clarification from stage 6 was still present, or a version of it. The noise was out. What remained was the problem and what I knew about it. I submitted the final answer packet. The indicator light turned green. I set the datapad down. The table received it without ceremony. The room was very quiet, not silent, because the ventilation system was still running and the monitoring array was still recording. But quiet in the way a room is quiet when the active work is done, and what remains is simply the fact of having done it. I sat in the green-lit room and waited. The door opened 11 minutes later. Not Advisor Hollis, a different Vithrani, older, the silver gray of high age, wearing an institutional sash that indicated a rank my directory knowledge placed somewhere in the senior faculty tier. He was accompanied by Hollis and by a third Vithrani I didn't recognize. All three of them stopped in the doorway and looked at me. I looked back. "Mr. Callum," the senior Vithrani said. His translation unit rendered his voice as a dry, even tenor standard professional Vithrani, the same register as Hollis. "My name is Director Fenath. I hold the chair of Assessment Sciences at this academy." "Hello. You submitted your final answer packet." "Yes." The sequence logged a completion event at 2 hours and 7 minutes. He said this with the Vithrani stillness, not the professional version, something older and more fundamental. The previous record for any stage completion was stage 8, reached in 4 hours and 51 minutes by a Durath candidate. No candidate has previously submitted a final answer packet. No candidate has previously completed the sequence. "Okay." Hollis made a small sound that my familiarity with Vithrani social audio told me was not distress, but something adjacent to recalibration, the verbal equivalent of a held breath finding its way out. "I have a question," Director Fenath said, "before we proceed to the administrative review, which will be extensive." "Go ahead." The proctor logged a non-standard anomaly beginning in stage 3. The anomaly was that your neural coherence index, the measure of how organized your brain's electrical activity remained under escalating stress, did not decline at any stage. In all prior candidates, across all species and all cohorts, the coherence index follows a degradation curve. The slope varies by species and individual, but the direction is constant. Yours did not decline. It stabilized. And in stages 6 and 7, it briefly increased. I thought about this. "The clarification," I said. "What is the clarification?" "It's what I'd call it. When you're far enough into genuine fatigue that the non-essentials have stopped using resources, the thinking gets simpler, clearer." Director Fenath was still for a long moment. Behind him, the third Vithrani I didn't know had produced a recording device and was making careful use of it. "Humans experience this regularly?" Fenath asked. "The ones who spend time in hard environments do. It's something you train toward, or at least something you train to use when it arrives." The sequence's escalation model treats increasing coherence as a diagnostic error. It is designed to interpret a rising coherence index as a sensor malfunction and flag for manual review. He paused. "It flagged for manual review 7 times during your assessment." "Is that why the indicator light was flickering?" Hollis made the recalibration sound again. "Yes," Fenath said. "The proctor believed its monitoring array was malfunctioning. It continued escalating under the assumption that when the malfunction was corrected, it would find the degradation curve it expected." He paused. "It did not find it." "No. You were not in distress." "I was in discomfort. That's different." There is a distinction between discomfort and distress that sounds philosophical until you've had to use it in practice, and then it becomes one of the most practically important distinctions available to you. Discomfort is the presence of an unwanted stimulus. Distress is the judgment that the unwanted stimulus is more than you can bear. You can be profoundly uncomfortable, in pain, afraid, exhausted, uncertain, without being in distress, if you have declined to make the judgment. The judgment is optional. Most species apparently didn't know this. Another Vithrani stillness. Director Feneth looked at me with the offset focal point, and then, in a deliberate adjustment I recognized as intentional rather than anatomical, shifted to look at me directly, a gesture that cost a Vithrani real effort and that I understood in context as significant. Your credentials from Vastarath will be reviewed and recognized. I expect the review to be thorough and to take some time, as the committee will want to understand what the credentials represent in light of today's assessment. In the interim, you will be classified at the Academy's highest provisional rating, which carries full access to advanced-level coursework. Thank you. The assessment data will be studied. It wasn't a question or a request. It was a statement of intent, delivered with the directness of a man who ran a department and was telling me what his department was going to do. That's fine, I said. I set the datapad down on the table. The motion was unhurried. My hands were still steady, or steady enough. Is there anything you need? Holeth asked. I thought about it for a moment. The genuine tiredness was present and acknowledged. The room was at a comfortable temperature now that the Stage 6 climate manipulation had ceased. The monitoring array was still attached, and removing it would be the next practical step. I could use directions to the cafeteria, I said. Holeth made a sound I hadn't heard a Vithrani make before. It took me a moment to recognize it as a laugh, a short, involuntary exhale of something that was not distress and was not recalibration, but was genuinely startled amusement. She covered it immediately, with the professionalism of a Vithrani administrative specialist who understood when and how to maintain composure. Director Feneth looked at me for a long moment. "Third corridor to the left," he said. "The human-compatible food station is on the eastern wall." I thanked him. Holeth removed the monitoring array. The sensor pads came off without drama. My skin was marked where they'd been, not injured, just the minor indentation of things that had been there for 2 hours and 7 minutes. 2 hours and 7 minutes. I'd gone in at the start of the standard assessment window, expecting to be there for 4 or 5 hours at best, expecting to be scored on however many stages I managed. The sequence had been built for 8 hours. I had not planned to be done this early. I had a coffee that was probably still warm in my bag, and I hadn't eaten since the caloric supplement in the room, and I was tired in the way that a body is tired after something real. I walked out into the corridor. The institutional lighting was the standard cool blue-white of Vithrani facilities, the floors polished to a high shine that reflected back a version of me, slightly wavering, as reflections in polished floors are, that looked, honestly, like someone who'd had a long morning. The third corridor to the left had a sign in 7 languages. I found the one I could read and followed the arrow. Behind me, the assessment room was already busy. I could hear the administrative process beginning, voices, equipment, the specific quality of institutional response to something that didn't have a precedent. They'd be reviewing the logs for a long time. They'd be revising the calibration models, updating the comparative data set, rewriting whatever documentation covered the edge case of a candidate whose neural coherence went up under load instead of down. All of that was reasonable and good, and not my problem right now. My problem right now was coffee, and whether the Eastern Wall's human-compatible food station stocked it, and if not, what the local equivalent was. The cafeteria smelled like food from 12 different species, warm and overlapping and oddly comfortable. I found the Eastern Wall and stood in front of it for a moment, reading the options. There was something that the label said was derived from a plant-based roasting process and contained stimulant compounds analogous to caffeine, formulated for human metabolic tolerance. It came in a cylindrical container slightly narrower than a standard mug, and when I pressed the dispense button it was hot. I sat down at a table in the corner of the cafeteria and drank it. It didn't taste much like coffee. It tasted like something that was trying to be coffee and had the right general structure of the idea without the accumulated specific knowledge of it. But it was hot, and it was bitter, and it was something to hold. The cafeteria filled up around me as the mid-morning period moved toward lunch. Cadets of 8 or 10 species came and went, and none of them paid me particular attention. I was one new face among many, and the cafeteria was a social environment where faces came and went, and the general noise was too much to track individual arrivals. Nobody knew, sitting here, what had just happened in the assessment room at the end of the East Wing. Nobody here knew what the sequence was, or what completing it meant, or why the chair of Assessment Sciences was currently in a review meeting that would probably run through the afternoon. I drank my almost coffee. I was tired. I had a lot of coursework ahead of me, and a credential review to wait for, and the administrative process that Director Feneth had described as extensive would undoubtedly generate paperwork in quantities I'd underestimated. There were things to do, and they were mostly going to be fine. I ordered a second almost coffee and ate something from the Eastern Wall that the label described as compatible with human nutrition, and that tasted, improbably, like a decent approximation of something my grandmother used to make on cold mornings. A grain dish, slightly sweet, with a texture that wasn't quite right but was close enough that I sat with it for a moment and let it be close enough. Somewhere in the East Wing, a door was open that the Academy had thought was sealed. They'd be a while figuring out what to do about that. I finished the food. I finished the coffee. I stacked the container and the bowl in the return slot the way the sign above the slot requested, because that was the done thing, and then I looked up the map of the Academy's Eastern Campus on my personal datapad and found the library. I had coursework to start,